On our journey today, we're going to check out the interior of the entryway to the Dakota apartment building where musician John Lennon was murdered. So, slide on your backpack and grab your passport and come along with me as we travel back in time. This video is sponsored by Audible Adventures. Kindly sign up for an annual subscription today. It is a great way to support my research and my productions. Welcome along, fellow time travelers. This is Scott Cardinal. Thanks for joining me on another photo analysis video. Today we are traveling back in time to New York City in December of 1980. This is part 2, which will showcase what may or may not have happened here in the evening of December 8th of 1980 when John Lennon was murdered. So let's start our photo analysis. As mentioned previously, this photo was chosen because there are no people in it. Also, this is what it looked like in 1980 when John Lennon lived at the Dakota. In fact, this photo shows you where John Lennon was murdered on the evening of December 8th, 1980. The murderer was standing close to where the photographer was standing when this photo was taken. Probably a bit more to the right, but in this general vicinity. It has been said that John Lennon was about 9 to 10 feet away from him when he was shot. So he was standing about where that sign was. And so now that you have this photo in front of you, take a look at it as I tell you how the story goes. John Lennon was walking through the entryway when he got shot multiple times in the back with hollow point bullets. One of the bullets hit his upper arm and shoulder, destroying the bones and muscles, rendering his arm completely useless. One of the bullets missed John Lennon and hit the glass in the window of that door. It has been said that John Lennon was carrying a box or a bag filled with cassettes from that evening's recordings. So even though he only has the use of one arm, he continued holding on to the cassettes, as the story goes. So that is an important piece of information because even though he only has use of one arm, he supposedly continued holding on to those cassettes. The story then continues that John Lennon managed to superhumanly keep walking while his internal organs were completely destroyed, his veins and his arteries were completely torn to shreds. No blood was going where it needed to be anymore. All the circuits have been shut off. Now, as you know, arteries are blood vessels responsible for carrying blood away from the heart to the body. And veins are blood vessels that carry blood from the body back to the heart for reoxygenation. And as I'm sure you know, balance is often referred to as our sixth sense because it relies on input from several areas of the body to keep you from falling. It requires gaze stability, gait stability, and spatial orientation. So consider that our ears, our eyes, our brain, our spinal cord, our heart, and our muscles all work together to help humans stand and to walk. And so the story goes that even though essentially everything inside of John Lennon was completely destroyed or falling apart and shutting down, he continued to walk another 10 to 15 feet or so without collapsing. And then, the story goes, he had the energy and the balance and the mental focus to step up onto the sidewalk. And even though he didn't have blood or oxygen going anywhere anymore that it needed to be, he still had the physical strength and the balance and the mental acuity to lift and extend the one arm that he had that wasn't shot to shreds to open up that door. Incidentally, how did he reach out to grab that door handle and then open that door if he was still holding a box or a bag of cassettes? I have no idea. Does anybody know the answer to that question? By the way, take a look at that door. Imagine for a moment what would be involved with opening it while you are bleeding to death and have only one arm to use, while you are holding a box or a bag of cassettes. If he used his left arm, then I guess he would have swung the door all the way open and then maneuvered his way in inside the vestibule before the door closed. That would have taken quite a bit of energy and balance, right? Or did he use his right hand? If so, then that also would have taken some balance and some muscles to pull it wide enough to be able to step through. And once again, how did he still manage to hold on to the cassettes this whole time? After all, how do you grab a door handle when you're holding on to a box or a bag while your arm is all shot up and you're bleeding to death? I have no idea. But once again, he still does manage to hold on to the cassettes this whole time. By the way, was it a shoulder bag? If so, why on earth didn't it ever slide down his arm and down to the floor? Was the strap maybe thrown over his head and then went across his body, and that way his head, his neck kept it from falling? Clearly not, as will be explained later. And so once again, the story goes that John Lennon, after being shot multiple times, he managed to continue walking, and then he stepped up onto the curb, and then he opened up that door, and then he went inside the vestibule, and then he turned right. And then, while still having lots of strength and energy and balance, despite having no blood or oxygen circulating, and neither his heart nor his lungs functioning, and being just a total bloody mess, he managed to lift his, let's just say, his left leg up, and then his right leg, and then his left leg, and then his right leg. And he's just walking up and down, up and down, up and down multiple times in order to walk up an entire flight of steps. And then once he reached the top, he came across a really big and heavy door, and he just went ahead and opened up that door. And then he finally entered the security office. And then, after all that, and with blood pouring out of his mouth and his nose and filling up his lungs and his heart totally destroyed and being unable to breathe or even think straight because, no blood's going to his brain, he was able to somehow look at Yoko and identify who she was or to the guard, and depending on the version of events you read, and clearly still being mentally alert and with great presence of mind, he told them that he had been shot. And it was only then, at that point, that he supposedly finally dropped those cassettes. And then he collapsed to the ground on his face, with his arms spread out atop of him, as if he was going to dive into a pool. By the way, if one of his arms was totally blown apart and ripped to shreds from a hollow point bullet, how did that arm get lifted and placed above his head? And then the story goes that the guard, who was on duty, he supposedly turned John Lennon over, and he saw the extent of his wounds, and it was at that point that he decided to call the police. But if he turned him over, how come it was later reported that the police found him face down with his arms over his head, as I had described, as if he was diving into a pool? Which story is it? And so the police finally arrived minutes later, and they saw what was going on, and they carried John Lennon, who at that point was white as death from the loss of so much blood. And it was then, when he was in the back of a police car, that he supposedly vocally confirmed to one of the police officers and said, "Yes, I'm John Lennon." So, how much of all that do you think really happened? Do you question anything in your life, or do you just believe everything you read? Let's back up a bit and go over a few things. Many of us have read that John Lennon looked at the murderer as he walked by. We later found out that wasn't true. But even if it was true, how on earth would anybody know since there were no eyewitnesses? So, we were lied to. Many of us have read that the murderer called out, "Mr. Lennon," and we later found out that wasn't true. But even if it was true, how on earth would anybody know since there were no eyewitnesses? So, we were lied to. Many of us read that John Lennon was shot so many times on the side of his body that he was turned around, swiveled around, and was facing his killer during the final shots. We later found out that wasn't true. So, we were lied to. Many of us read that John Lennon was shot in the chest after swiveling around. We later found out that wasn't true. How do we know? Because none of the bullets entered from the front. At least that's what the doctors and those working in the emergency room said. So, we were lied to. Many of us read that one of the bullets flew over John Lennon's head, went through the courtyard, and smashed a window in an apartment on the north side of the building. We later found out that wasn't true. So, we were lied to. Many of us read that after getting shot, John Lennon continued walking through the entire entryway. That's 40 feet. And then he went through that second set of gates, and then he turned right, and then he walked another 25 feet or so, and then he ascended a set of stairs, left, right, up, down, up, down, up, down, after walking, at that point, what is that, 50, 65 feet? And then he pushed open the heavy mahogany door leading to the lobby in the southeast quadrant of the building. We later found out that was not true. So, we were lied to. In reference to John Lennon saying that he had been shot, I suppose that could possibly be true, but here is something you might want to think about. Imagine if you were walking and suddenly something hits you in the back and penetrates your body and destroys your internal organs, and your body begins to shut down and you're beginning to die. Why would you assume you were shot? And would you be able to say it while your mouth and nose and lungs are overflowing with blood? And unless you are expecting to be shot, if anything, wouldn't you assume that something nearby exploded and maybe you were just hit with shrapnel? I was with somebody who was shot in the back. I've talked about this before. This gentleman had no idea he was shot. Neither did I. That's just not something you think about. Your mind sort of fades in and out as your body and mind shuts down. It's a horrible, horrible thing being shot. And you're trying to just figure out how to survive. You don't think, oh, I've been shot. You see, being shot in real life isn't like a scene from a movie. Gunshots don't sound like they do in movies. And people don't die from gunshot wounds in real life the way they die in movies. This isn't a Western. Now, most people can't even relate to what it's like to hear gunshots or to be shot. So, if you want to try to relate to this a little bit more, imagine you're standing or sitting where you are while you're listening to me talk. And suddenly, someone appears behind you and they plunge two 10-inch stainless steel knives into the middle of your back. You know, the kind with the jagged edges? And then once the knives are now inside your body, they twist them and they turn them. And then they start jacking them up and down and left and right, destroying everything they touch inside your body. And then they pull the knives out and they stab you again and again and again in your back. And then they twist and they turn them and they jack them up and down inside of you, just tearing your entire insides apart. And then, at the same time, someone else appears behind you and they hit your shoulder blade as hard as they can with a sledgehammer. And then someone else appears behind you and they hit you with an axe in the same exact spot, ripping apart all the skin and the muscles around your upper arm. And so now you've got blood coming out of there too. And you're dealing with an incredible amount of pain. What's the worst pain you've ever felt in your life? Have you ever walked into something and hit your shin, hurt your ankle, dropped something on your hand, your finger? Multiply that times 1,000,000. And so now you're dealing with just a ton of pain, okay? And then someone shoves cherry bombs into the holes in your back, and now you've got explosions going on in your body. This all sounds horrible, right? Well, this gives you maybe a small idea of what it's like to get shot by hollow point bullets. It is physical and mental torture. Thankfully, it doesn't last very long. Anyway, do you think if all that happened to you, that you would know what happened to you? Take a look around you. Look about 10 to 15 feet to your left or to your right or in front of you. Do you think you could walk that far and continue carrying a box or a bag of cassettes? And then when you get 10 or 15 feet away, you can use your one arm to open up a door and then ascend a flight of steps and then open another door. And then when you get there, you can say to somebody, "I've been stabbed and hit with an axe." Probably not. So, I'm sure you could understand why quite a number of people, especially those who have had experience dealing with gunshot victims, as I have, find it incredibly difficult, impossible, to believe that everything we have read about what happened to John Lennon actually happened, especially since they were written by frantic journalists up against deadlines. But if it makes you feel better to believe everything that you read, and you're okay with the idea of John Lennon being in excruciating physical and mental and emotional pain while he was bleeding to death, and that he was completely conscious, which means he knew that he would never see his wife and children and friends and family ever again, and would not live to see another day, then go ahead and believe that. Because maybe all that happened. Maybe John Lennon was the first and only human being in history to get shot in the back multiple times with hollow point bullets and then went walking around, opening up doors, ascending stairs, and talking to people. I suppose anything's possible. But I'm not sure why anybody would want to think all that. But it's up to them. They could believe whatever they want. But here is what the interior of the Dakota's entryway looks like. So now you've got an idea of space and distance and where things are located. So you go ahead and use your best judgment and maybe think to yourself, what would John Lennon want you to think? Would he want you to believe a bunch of words written by journalists who weren't there? Would John Lennon want you to blindly accept the testimonies of a distraught widow and a guard and a couple of police officers, all of whom meant well, but were sucked into the whirlwind of an incredibly chaotic series of events and quite possibly couldn't remember every single detail as they happened? I don't know. Maybe he would. I did not know John Lennon. But I do know that he did not seem to be the type of person who would just blindly accept everything that was told to him. John Lennon seemed to be a free thinker. What about you? Take a look at this entryway. Read the accounts of what different writers, who were never there, say happened that night, many of which have been disproven over the course of time. So think about it and wonder, but you might never know the truth, just like JFK, RFK, MLK, and so many others. Over the course of your life, you won't always know the answers to your questions. But that does not mean that you should just accept whatever the media tells you. Ever. People should question everything. I've been wondering lately if any good could possibly come from what happened to John Lennon that night. And it's impossible to think of anything. But maybe, just maybe, if you or someone else finally puts on the brakes and stops and thinks for a moment and begins to question that maybe not everything the media tells you, that everything you read and hear isn't 100% true, just because you want what they tell you to be true. And you begin to question things, and you begin to think for yourself a little bit. And even if you turn out to be 100% wrong, but you still question things, and you didn't just blindly accept what was told to you, then maybe, just maybe, something of some value might be garnered from this horror. Look, there's no way to save John Lennon, but maybe what happened to John Lennon might save other people if they finally start thinking for themselves. John Lennon died in 1980. The media wrote articles, and the broadcasters gave you news reports to keep you watching, to keep you listening, and to keep you believing what they tell you. Why? To educate you? Maybe. Or was it to keep you coming back so they can make a lot of money selling advertisements? After all, newspapers and broadcasters, they all have ads, and publishers, they want to sell books. And then 4 decades pass, and it's 2020, and the media is still writing articles, the publishers are still putting out books, and the broadcasters are giving news reports to keep you watching and listening and believing. Why? To educate you? Maybe. Or do they do all of this to keep you coming back so they can make money selling advertisements and selling books? I think that John Lennon would want you to question the motives of anyone that tells you anything. Even me. Question me. But I'm not trying to tell you what's right or wrong. I'm not trying to tell you what to believe or not believe. I'm not saying these are the facts of how it happened. I'm telling you what I read. I'm telling you what I see. I tell you what I come across. And you can make your own decisions. And I'm not trying to say anything is true or not true. I'm not trying to change your mind about anything concerning what happened to John Lennon. You decide for yourself. But don't believe everything you read and are told. Question things. Maybe that's the lesson to be learned for people all around the world. Maybe there's this lesson of what happened to John Lennon, and maybe it's to just question things that you're told. Anyway, I really hope that this finally answers a lot of questions that people have had, and perhaps I'm hoping for too much, but perhaps maybe now some people can finally put the events of December 8th, 1980 out of their minds, once and for all, because no good can possibly come from dwelling on negative events. Incidentally, had the murder not happened, then John and Yoko would have normally walked through this entryway and then passed through the 10-foot-tall double pedestrian gate that blocks access to the courtyard. And if so, then he would have been home. And John Lennon would have lived to see another day. And so this concludes this photo analysis of the interior of the entryway of the Dakota apartment building. I hope that this gives you a good understanding of how interesting and beautiful the Dakota apartment building is, and that there's a lot more to the entryway than what happened to John Lennon there. If you have any thoughts about this subject matter, please put those in the comments below and share what's on your mind. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. You could also go on Amazon or any other bookseller and order some of the books that I've written about the Dakota. Please also download the Audible Adventures app on your iPhone or Android. I do look forward to you joining me again for another photo analysis video. Until next time, I wish you safe travels on all your journeys.